everyone. Hey, sorry for the delay. We had a brief little technical snafu getting set up, but we're here now. We're live. This is the first Cocktail Wonk live stream on savvy.co, which is very exciting. My name is Will Hookinga, and I'm here with Matt Pietrek, who you can see on the screen there. And Matt, you actually just a couple of days ago, I think, published a new article related to the very topic that you're going to discuss today. All about kind of a new idea, a new way to think about rum categories. I'm curious. I know anytime something like that comes out, the opinions can start to fly a little bit. What has the response been like so far?
It's been interesting. A lot of general sort of like, yeah, we love the idea here. We like the discussion, and a few people who are, I don't want to say resistant, but maybe don't quite grasp what I'm shooting for, and and some good technical discussions about it, which is great. I called it a modest proposal, and that means you put something on the table, and then if we think it's worthwhile, we can iterate over it and make it better, and hopefully get some companies to agree to here's some basic additional information we can share. So
For sure.
we'll talk more about that. We'll talk more about that in a bit.
Yeah. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But yeah, I mean, that's the whole purpose of stuff like this, is to kind of further that conversation. So we're going to get started in just a minute. First, before we do, I want to go over the agenda real quick with everyone. So first of all, as many of you have already seen, if you look to the right, you will see a chat window. And then if you look at the bottom, you'll see a question box that says ask a question. So if you have any questions for Matt that occur to you throughout the presentation, feel free to pop it in down there. At the end, we're going to take 10 to 20 minutes or so to do a little Q&A where Matt will answer your questions. And the question box is the best way to make sure we see it. Also, we'd love for you to share this event with your friends, invite them to join in. There's a share button at the top, so you can share it on Facebook, Twitter, send the link directly. We always love getting as many people as possible hanging out and talking about rum with us. So first of all, let's talk about Matt for a second before we jump in. So if you're here right now, there's a good chance you might know Matt from his website, cocktailwonk.com. Where he's written some of the most in-depth information about rum you can find online. One of my go-to resources for rum. He and his wife, Carrie, recently published a book as well called Minimalist Tiki that I hope you all have seen. It's full of not only tiki cocktail recipes, but kind of a whole new way of thinking, or an ethos about tiki. So today, Matt's going to talk about rum categories, why some of them kind of suck, why some of them are useful, what could be better about them. So Matt, to start off, why is there so much confusion around rum categorization? What is kind of the root problem of the way we use categories to describe rum?
Right. I think about this quite a bit. The key things to keep in mind is that categorization is a tool that we use for different things, and there is no one perfect category for any given scenario. I always like to come back to the topic of cars, vehicles and categories. You say, well, how would you categorize, how would you categorize vehicles? And you can say, well, let's do it by color, which is fantastic. Easy to understand, fairly unambiguous, useful when you're trying to, if you're an Uber driver trying to get somebody to understand, like, hey, I'm coming here in a blue car. That's useful information.
Right.
But it's not useful for, like, if you want to rent a car. Well, what kind of car would you like to rent? Like a blue car. Not relevant. And so, I think, for any category, and the reality is we make up our own categories, for different scenarios. There's no one category for any topic like cars or rum or vacation destinations. There's no one category. But the things I always want to think about are, there's like 4 questions. Number one is this categorization, or is this way of putting things into different buckets? Number one, is it unambiguous and clear? Like, there's no room for, like, subjectivity and, like, well, I think it should go in this bucket. I think it should go in that bucket.
Mm-hmm.
Blue bar is red. It's not, it's not, well, I think it's, so that's question number one. The second question is, who is the audience for this category? Like who's supposed to use this? What are they using it for? Number three is it easy to understand? And number four, is it useful? And so I'd say any categorization used for anything has to, you have to ask all those four questions. And
Right.
so, when you think about rum, we have a bunch of different categories. We'll go through them in a bit, but we have by color, by country, by colonial heritage, but and weird things like overproof or navy. Then we have more thoughtful categories like Gargano or Kate, Mark Cates. I think the Whiskey Exchange has a new one. But again, we said we have to ask, even for those, which we have to ask those questions for each of those. So for Gargano, it's perfectly valid to say, like, who is this for? Who's supposed to use this? Who is, or is it unambiguous? And I would it's unambiguous. Like the definitions are clear, and you could easily bucket things based on Gargano. But then, is it understandable? And is it useful? And those are all questions we have to consider for all these categories. And I think when some of the more common ones we see, go to an online liquor store and say, oh, rums, and then it's like, what sort of rums would you like to look at? And you get like white, gold, dark, overproof.
Right.
That's not really useful here. It's clear and unambiguous, but it's not useful. And so, if you've read my writing, you'll see what I'm trying to do is educate people, help elevate the category, sort of like inject some ideas, some thoughts, maybe even the right language, like change how we talk about rum, how to describe rum, and get people thinking that way. And the end goal is to elevate rum, and part of that is like the way we talk about it. And so, getting people to understand that some of the ways we talk about it are less than ideal and don't do it any great service. So that's sort of my long-winded, why categories suck.
No, that's good. And I think, when you start bringing in those questions, those four questions, for example, I think that's when it becomes easier to sort of appreciate the challenge in coming up with a system that is going to satisfy all the different stakeholders, So what Matt's going to do is we're gonna kind of run through what the most common categorization systems are and sort of talk about the flaws, the pros, the cons, and everything. So to start out, we're going to look at three categorization systems that are probably among the most common that you might see. So those are by color, by country, by colonial history. So Matt, starting with color, this is probably the most famous. It just came up in a number of examples. What are the common color categories, and why do you think this is such a flawed system?
Yeah, so it's there on the slide, and you did a great job. I will say Will made these slides and did a great job, so thank you, Will.
Thank you. No, I'm blushing.
More creative than I would have been. But talk about rums, obviously, it's a light rum, it's a silver rum or white rum, gold. These typically, get used a lot of times in recipes. Like, oh, such and such bar's Mai Tai recipe, and it's like 1 ounce dark rum, 1 ounce white rum.
Right.
That is completely, completely irrelevant. My fundamental problem with the by color categorization is that more often than not, we're looking for a specific flavor profile. We're not picking a rum because, oh, the gold color matches the green of the mint leaves. Like color is rarely an aesthetic thing when it comes to picking rum. I mean, you may not want a black rum daiquiri, but that said, usually, especially in the recipe context, we're looking for a specific flavor profile. And as we know, the color of a rum, or at least this is what I'm trying to educate people, and many people know, is the color of the rum has no bearing on the flavor profile. So
Mm-hmm.
I can take rums. I can take, rum fire, which is a clear rum,
Mm-hmm.
and clear rum, 126 proof, and I can take Don Q Cristal, and I can put them, side by side in front of a casual consumer, and say, hey, these are both white rums, and we know they're wildly different.
A little bit different, yeah.
Yeah, completely different. And nothing on the label, other than maybe the rum fire flames and stuff, sort of going to indicate to the consumer uh, the wildly different flavor profile and how different they are. So, within the white category, you say like let's list some. Like you have obviously the very light sort of Spanish heritage, Don Q Cristal, Bacardi Silver. Then you've got unaged Blanc Agricole, unaged rum
Mm-hmm.
agricole. Wild different. You've got Jamaican Overproof. You've got the lightly aged and filtered, Rio McCoy 3,
Right.
Havana Club 3. All these, the funny thing is the vast majority of white rums, if you will, are actually aged. People seem like, oh, they're not aged. You didn't spend any time in the barrel because they're white. And like, no,
Mm-hmm.
the vast majority, if you go by volume, you look at the regulations of Puerto Rico, for example, they have to be aged. They're aged and filtered. And an aged and filtered white rum tastes different from an unaged, completely unaged rum. So that's white. And then you get into like gold and amber. The reality is that the vast majority of rums have some amount of caramel in them. Again, if you go by volume, there's some amount of caramel in them, and and I'm not criticizing caramel is necessarily a bad thing, but producers typically use it to equalize out color so that like every bottle looks pretty much the same on the shelf. I understand their lament. Like we would love to not use caramel, but if we send two rums that taste great, two bottles that taste great, but one's lighter than the other, the stores might send one back. Consumers are
Right.
gonna have a preference for the darker one because they don't understand this. So so um, there are gold rums out there, or gold or whatever color you want to call it out there that have no aging whatsoever. They're entirely caramel. The example that always comes to mind is the Hampton one. I think it's Hampton Gold, but it's
Mm-hmm.
unaged. It has on it, but it has caramel in it. And if you go back in rum history, like you would actually see that the colonies, when they were British colonies, when they were shipping rum, they would basically sell it as white or gold, I think it was, or colored, and it was basically just like, oh, you want colored? We'll just add some caramel to it before we ship it off to you. And then the most sort of like egregious example is when you get the dark rums or black rums, and so many stories talk about somebody for people who aren't rum experts are writing about rum and say, oh, the dark rums have been aged the longest, and the reality is that's almost certainly untrue. That the
Right.
darker the rum, more caramel it has. And so if you buy a $20 bottle of Caruba, which is a lovely rum, it's not because it's dark. It doesn't mean it spent 25 years in the barrel. It's actually a pretty young rum. And so, the color of the rum is just is completely orthogonal to the flavor profile or the age and all those sort of things. So that's color is my number one category that I think sucks.
Yeah. Always a good place to start with color. Very a big source of confusion, and as you said, it's almost every week that another article gets written, like categorizing rums by color, and the rum circle of the internet just kind of sighs collectively.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so the next
And
one,
say like it doesn't hurt or it doesn't help sometimes. It's bad enough that liquor stores will do
right?
it, but then brands themselves do that. We're trying to brand like, if you're fighting for, the elevated category, maybe don't label your rum gold rum. you know?
Sure.
Yeah. So anyhow, go on.
Yeah, so moving on to the next one, this is another very common one by colonial history that I think may have you may say has somewhat more utility than by color, but certainly has its own shortcomings or sources of confusion as well. So what is kind of the what's the reason for categorizing rums by colonial history in the first place?
Right. So, as I understand it, and this is an interview I did with Luca Gargano about 2 years ago. He said he was the one who sort of originated this classification,
Hmm.
and himself is now sort of like walked away from it. So like it's not that useful. So, don't quote me on that, but that's about this. My takeaway from there. I would say that the colonial classification system, and I'm going to say something and I'm going to reverse it later, but the colonial classification system took advantage of some historical happenings that essentially led to three different sort of styles of rum making. And so, just for example, the English style, which is the original, what we would call English style today, was the original way rum was made, starting 1640 or so in Barbados. It was that way everywhere. They all they had were pot stills. They were distilling primarily molasses. It was sort of like just that was the technology of the time,
Hmm.
and it was all like that. And then the French and the Spanish style, sort of, the French colonies and the Spanish colonies, basically started making rum in a different way for various historical reasons. In the case of the French, um, basically, there involves Napoleon and a whole bunch of history, which I don't want to go into terribly much here.
Sure.
But the idea was that one of the primary reasons was that the French islands could not get their sugar back to the French, the motherland, if you will, in Europe. Essentially, their market for sugar collapsed. Like they had all these plantations, they're growing sugar. It collapses. They can't. Therefore, they can't sell sugar. They're not making profit, and so it becomes incredibly difficult to keep running these plantations if they're not making any money. And so if you're not milling sugar and making molasses, then you're not making rum. Some clever people, and I'm not going to say the French invented the style, but they started saying, well, screw molasses. Let's just make rum from the cane juice directly. You actually get more yield. You're not taking, some amount of the fermentable sugar and shipping it off in the form of sugar. Like you're using all that fermentable sugar to make rum. So, the French islands in particular adopted that cane juice, the use of cane juice, and it happened slowly. It wasn't like an immediate thing. It happened over the
Hmm.
course of a century or so. And I could go off quite a bit about that colonial history, but so that sort of evolved into the sort of like cane juice rum distilled in a column still. And then the Spanish as well. The Spanish colonies were basically prevented from making rum till around 1796. Again, a
Hmm.
lot of history to go into, but essentially the Spanish got a very late start in the game. By the time they were able to distill rum, Barbados had been distilling rum already for 100, 150 years. And so they came to the game relatively late, and they were able to take advantage of the newer technology of that time, which was the column still. The English, in particular Jamaicans, or like clung to the column still or to the pot still for a very long time, whereas the Spanish were sort of coming new into it. Like, well, hey, there's these fancy new new column stills, and like let's use them. And so it was history that sort of like caused different sort of colonial, you know, powers to distill rum differently. The problem with it is that the world didn't stay still after that happened, and so a blind, basically producer, different rum distilleries kept coming online and doing things differently, and so trying to for every if you take say English style rum and you say what means pot or column still or a blend and molasses, somebody's going to come along with but wait, this distillery is using cane juice,
Right.
and so you get more and more exceptions to the rule, and now reverse what I said earlier. I'd say it is actually a useful categorization in some contexts for people who really understand rum. Like if you study it enough, it actually is. It's a great convenient shorthand for if you say British style to me, like I know exactly what you mean, and I know in general parameters what that means, and I know there may be exceptions, but it's a useful categorization in some contexts, but it fails the unambiguous test. If we go to, if I say French style is cane juice and distilled in a column still, somebody's going to say, well, what about A1710 on Martinique? That's distilled in a pot still.
Right.
And so, it's like it's a useful shorthand, but you kind of have to know enough to build in all these like exceptions into your head. So but again, for me, it's also, for somebody who studies history and writes about history a lot, I have the advantage of going back in time and, talking about around in, say, the 1800s, where these styles were much more sort of locked in. In
Mm-hmm.
today's world, where everybody's doing all sorts of interesting stuff, it's less useful.